Hey there, guys. Welcome to another episode of Schiz and Giggles. My name's Cody. I have schizophrenia.
Hey, my name's Kit, and I have schizoaffective disorder.
And today we are cosplaying as neurotypical people. For anyone watching on YouTube, you might notice Kit is wearing an amazing shirt that says cosplaying as a neurotypical person. That is our official merch shirt. So we finally have merch. We've already had a ton of support from people who have seen us posted in videos. And before we get into the topic today, which is early signs of schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, we wanted to tell you guys a little bit about our recent adventure and the shirt
Yes,
release
yes.
and all of that. So we recently attended GalaxyCon together, and I'm going to let Kit get into that a little bit before I talk to the shirt. Kit, how did you get me to a con event, and what was it like?
Well, first off, I got you to go because I asked you if you wanted to go, and you were like, yes. And so we all ended up in Columbus, Ohio, and had an absolute blast. I loved cosplaying. I always love cosplaying when I go to conventions, but this was Cody's first time cosplaying. And from what I understand, he had an amazing time cosplaying. Is that right?
Yeah, it was so much fun. Not what I was expecting. So much going on at these events, and I'm. We've talked about this. I'm a video game nerd. I collect Pokemon cards. I collect comic books. So I did not realize how much I was gonna love this space and the people there. And I even went all in. I did a full cosplay as Geralt of Rivia. You can see pictures on my Instagram. I'm very proud of it. I was very happy with how it turned out. Kit, of course, went above and beyond with several very cool cosplays. And it was just like a very, very cool space to be in. The people there were very welcoming. There was a lot of really interesting sessions, a lot of really cool actors and actresses and voice actors, and so much more going on than I could have ever believed. But we had a couple really cool things go on while we were there. We recorded some content, some videos. So if you guys saw some of our shorts that are doing really well about us being there, lots of fun recording that. We did work while we were there,
We
so
worked. We worked.
we put in some work while we were there. We were also having fun, but we did a little bit of work. And then on Sunday, the last day of the con, I finally wore our new merch shirt. So the one that Kit's wearing, cosplaying as a neurotypical person, huge hit at the con. People loved it. The funny story I have to tell about the shirt is I had a photography session with Matthew Lillard, who is he's done so many movies and TV shows, stuff like that. I know him as the live action Shaggy from Scooby Doo, and he's also in the Scream movies and stuff like that. But our biggest flex from this entire event, our biggest brag, is that when I went to go meet Matthew Lillard, he looked at the shirt and he was like, I love that. It's amazing. So our shirt is Matthew Lillard approved, by the way, and Allison Stoner approved. Allison Stoner is the voice of Isabella from Phineas and Ferb. She does a lot of other stuff. She was in Disney back when I was a kid, and she also loved the shirt. So if you guys want to get a shirt for yourself, you can find it on my website or the link in our bio on all of our social medias. We love your guys' support. Thank you all for wearing the shirts. If you get one, be sure to tag us in the photo of it. We'd love to reshare it. We'd love to see everyone cosplaying as neurotypical people, because I mean that's what we all have to do in our everyday lives. And shout out to Kit for the amazing saying that actually went on the shirt. She didn't realize that I was going to put
Nope.
it on a shirt, so
Absolutely not.
but I think she's super pumped about it. How did you feel seeing it for the first time?
I was overwhelmed because it's my first piece of merch ever, which is super exciting, and I'm so
Woo!
happy so happy that we have one, especially for the podcast. Like, that's just so exciting.
Yeah, so thank you guys again. And we've been receiving so much love and support on our videos every week. We just shared our Spotify Wrapped, which had so many cool facts in it that we didn't realize. We have followers in so many countries, and we have people listening all over the world. Some of you even have us as your favorite podcast right now,
Yeah, you guys
which,
are awesome. Just saying, like, you guys are
yeah,
absolutely fantastic.
yeah, we can't thank you guys enough. So, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for supporting the merch, supporting the podcast, and we're going to get into it and talk about early signs of schizophrenia, or as Kit the scientist would say,
The prodromal phase.
Okay.
So, I want to start this episode by explaining how psychotic episodes often have three phases to them. There is the prodromal phase, which is what I just mentioned, and it's what we're going to talk about today. But there's also the acute phase and the residual phase. The prodromal phase is how things start. The acute phase is when things are at their worst, and the residual phase is a natural conclusion where things calm down. So, Cody and I have talked about the acute phase and what goes on after all of that. But we haven't really talked about those early signs, those early symptoms, the things that happened that people didn't quite notice. But they're things that maybe if we talk about them, you might notice them in someone you know, or maybe even in yourself.
Yeah, and the reason I was really interested in doing this video is I had the unique situation of one of my loved ones, one of my caregivers, also lives with schizoaffective disorder. So, as a lot of our listeners know, hopefully all of our listeners know at this point, my mom also lives with schizoaffective disorder, which is what Kit is diagnosed with. And so, when I went through my diagnosis, I had someone close to me who could recognize the symptoms well before I was able to, well before anyone else in my life was able to. And there's obviously like the symptoms we all think of, right? You start to see your loved one talking to people who aren't there. That's a huge, obviously, sign. That's something that most people at that point can pick out and see. But there are a lot of smaller symptoms that pop up early on. So I think what's going to be interesting is we're going to talk about these symptoms both from what it was like experiencing them and what we remember of them, but also what it was like for the people around us and what they tell us about those symptoms early on, because some of those I don't remember early on, but my loved ones have filled me in with like, oh, this was the first thing we noticed, which was not the first thing I noticed. So, Kit, I'll let you get started here. Can you just talk about some of your early symptoms, what you remember, and maybe even like looking back now, what you might realize was actually your earliest symptoms?
One of the most common symptoms that people experience in prodromal phases is a newfound interest in religion or
Oh, okay.
spirituality. It's very common to have a sudden desire to learn more about God or the Bible or another kind of belief system out there. And so in my case, I decided I wanted to fixate on the Christian God, apparently. And I became extremely absorbed and interested in Christianity as a whole. So I was going to church services, I was reading the Bible, I was really diving into it. And unfortunately, I lived in the South, which is also the Bible Belt, so me being extremely interested in religion suddenly didn't seem like anything that was too far out there. And so that was the biggest symptom for me, but I also in doing all of that and getting more absorbed in psychosis, because for me, the interest in religion was caused by religious delusions, but having the interest in religion was just part of it. And so it was because of that that I started pulling away from people. And so I was no longer interacting with people as much as I used to. I was pulling away more and more the more time went on. So by the time my acute phase hit, my true psychotic break hit, I was I was pretty alone because I'd isolated from almost everybody I knew. So, those are the two big things I can remember from it. Those are the two glaring things. But the thing is about my story is that people around me didn't notice anything was wrong. They didn't know any of it at all. I was just going through all of this stuff and hiding it really well. But was that the same for you, or did people around you notice your early signs, say before you even knew anything was going on?
Yeah. So, obviously, after I was diagnosed and I was on medication and finally had some clarity, both my mom and my wife had told me that honestly, right when my symptoms started, they both saw a lot of the early signs, and I was unable to see any of them. I do remember moments where I recognized that I was. Hearing hallucinations, but in my brain, I didn't register that as a symptom because I was delusional and I thought that I was hearing the voice of other people. I thought I was like gaining some sort of special ability, because that's what a delusional brain does. It creates this narrative that is untrue, but your brain convinces you that it is true. So, um, It wasn't until I was diagnosed and medicated that I was able to look back and see like what the early signs really were for me. The first things my mom and my wife noticed was, and you just mentioned it, isolation. I think that's
Mhm.
the biggest thing that people see in early mental illness is people just out of nowhere really isolating themselves. And I'm a very outgoing person. I was not someone who ever like hid away from people. I wanted to be at events. I wanted to be in school. I was someone who wanted to be out doing things. And so it was obvious to my loved ones when I started isolating that that already was a red flag. The other thing that, I mean, there's so many of these like little symptoms that they recognized. A lack of motivation. I was having trouble focusing. I started struggling in school, which hadn't been a problem for me up until that point. And then like those symptoms all kind of appeared months before psychosis. Like that was all like well into like I was going to college. I was maintaining, pretty well. But then that's what led into the full blown psychosis. So for me, it's very similar to you. The first thing that everyone else noticed was the isolation. The first thing I noticed was the symptoms, the actual positive symptoms. So the auditory and visual hallucinations. But at the time, I didn't really register that that's what I was experiencing. And those are the most prevalent. I had the isolation. It sounds like you had that too. But obviously, we didn't list all of those. What were some other early signs that you either noticed then or looking back you're able to recognize might have been early warning signs of your diagnosis?
So what I was dealing with before my prodromal phase happened was a lot of bipolar symptoms. So I was experiencing that stuff, but it wasn't until my prodromal phase of my psychotic break that I started experiencing symptoms of what would really become known as schizoaffective disorder, even though the whole time I was still hearing voices 24/7. And so the other things that were happening to me was that I was again hearing voices. So I wasn't hearing any more voices than usual in terms of the normal regulars, but I was starting to hear the voice of God as part of it. And that was new. Looking back on it, that was when I probably should have realized something was wrong, but I didn't because I didn't have any insight. But I also started getting some avolition, a lack of motivation. I found it hard to experience pleasure in things. So I had some anhedonia. And those are both negative symptoms. And negative symptoms are part of schizoaffective disorder and schizophrenia in the criteria. And so started experiencing all that stuff, and I couldn't figure out why I didn't want to do things. I couldn't figure out why things weren't making me as happy as they used to. And so those things probably should have been red flags for me, but I again had no insight, so I had no idea. And people around me, I just hid it so well that they didn't notice. But the biggest thing was probably the social withdrawal. It was
Yeah.
probably pulling away from people. And it's so important to mention that people think that people with psychotic disorders are violent and dangerous and harmful, but in reality, a lot of us just don't want to be around anybody. We want to isolate. We have no desire to be out in public with people. And so that's always something I try to say because when I was going through all of this, when I was experiencing these things, I was away from people. I didn't want to be with anybody. I was entirely asocial for the majority of it. So, but those are the things I really think about. And I guess that would make me ask you, are there other things that you notice in retrospect? Are there things that you notice in the moment? Like, are there just other symptoms you went through during this time?
Yeah, I think a few more that really registered with me. These are things I noticed later on. There's a few things that like my wife and mom didn't mention, but I realized once I was medicated and I had more insight and I was really like looking back on that part of my life. Um, uh, I had a lot of issues with affect
Oh,
and
yeah.
disorganized speech.
Mm,
Allison used to talk about how when she would try to have conversations with me, I would say words, but none of it would make sense. It would be ramblings. So like that's one that like I recognized was a very prominent symptom. The other one, and this is always more embarrassing to talk about because no one wants to admit this. I had a really tough time with, and you talked about it a little bit in the fact that it's harder to um, like take care of yourself. I
Oh,
really
yeah,
started
yeah.
to struggle. I started to struggle a lot with personal hygiene.
Yes,
I
yes.
was not taking care of myself in that aspect at all. And like the people around me, like they noticed it, but they never. No one wants to talk about that. I feel like because it's one of those things that it's hard to talk about. No one wants to make a person feel bad, and it can be embarrassing for us as patients to realize like, hey, there were weeks that I didn't brush my teeth or
Yeah.
shower or do those things, and that sucks, and it's embarrassing to like admit that and say that, but that was a real thing, and it's something that when symptoms come up I still struggle with a bit. And the last thing I'll say too was just uh, I I noticed I was having a lot more fatigue. And I think this goes into the difficulty taking care of myself, and a lot of the decline in hygiene, stuff like that was just I was so fatigued, I was exhausted, I was worn down from all these symptoms that I was beginning to experience. So I think that kind of leads us well into how that got into our later symptoms. So as you mentioned, then comes the acute phase. So can you talk a little bit about more what that phase is and what you noticed in yourself with that phase?
So the acute phase is more of a time when psychosis is at its worst. It's when the symptoms are the most intense. It's when a detachment from reality often occurs. The prodromal phase is the beginnings where it's kind of maybe sort of starting to happen, but the acute phase is where it all hits the fan and it takes over. You're experiencing hallucinations, delusions, the disorganized speech is all there for sure. Like it's all firmly there. And for me, that came across as a complete loss of like control mentally when it came to figuring out what was real and what wasn't. I was entirely absorbed in religion. I thought that God was telling me the people in my life were not going to be here anymore, and I had to deal with that, and that was like my whole thing. And so I just remember that during my prodromal phase, I had an interest in religion, but during my acute phase, religion was my life. Like there was no way around it. And the people around me, yeah, they noticed things were wrong at that point. That was when people really started to notice things were wrong with me. But I, it was it was very it was very sad to go from having a mild interest in religion, pulling away from people, having not much motivation, lack of social interaction, but then going to a place where I feel so alone, so isolated, and I'm stuck with my hallucinations and my delusions as being all I see, all I hear, all I do, and it just took over my life. And so for a lot of people the acute phase is when psychosis does take over their life, but it's when things are at their worst, it's when they're often at their most scary, and it's when really bad things can happen if people are not careful.
Yeah, and this is the acute phase is, and we've talked about this on several episodes. The acute phase is where my auditory and visual hallucinations really went full blown, and I ended up using drugs as a way to try to cope with it. So, leading into the acute phase, like the most prominent thing early on for me was the very first symptom that I think put me into the acute phase was intense paranoia. When the
Mm,
paranoid thoughts started for me, that's when I really fell deep into these symptoms, and I very quickly afterwards started experiencing the hallucinations and then into the delusional thoughts. But for me, the paranoia was like that bridge almost into the acute phase, because that's where I went from like being a little suspicious of people to full
mhm,
on thinking that Allison was poisoning my food, or she was trying to sedate me so she could bring me into a psychiatric facility. Like all of these paranoid thoughts started, and then when the hallucination started, they were telling me things to back up these thoughts I was already having, which is why I ended up turning to drugs as a way to try to silence some of those voices and a way to try to deal with some of those symptoms. And like you said, the acute phase is where we see, unfortunately, the worst of the symptoms, which means the worst of the results if left untreated. This is where we see people with schizophrenia becoming the highest rates of addiction and homelessness and incarceration, is because when we get into this phase without the proper treatment or care, it's very hard to navigate navigate life outside of it. Like if we can't get people help before the acute phase, sometimes it's too late. And so I think we're examples of people who are lucky that we were able to, with treatment, medication, family help, things like that, we were able to get through the more acute phase. But there are some people who unfortunately will lose their lives or end up in very terrible situations without the right treatment and assistance. So I do want to acknowledge that this is another point where I feel very privileged that I was able to get out of this really intense phase within a matter of a few years, whereas a lot of people sometimes are stuck in the acute phase without treatment, without medication. Like in my mom's case, she went almost a decade with no treatment, no medication, things like that.
It's really scary how just a simple difference in access to resources can change someone's outcome.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially if we can get to people before this phase, which is why I think talking about early symptoms is so important because we want people to be able to see these symptoms in their loved ones. Unfortunately, it's hard to see it in yourself, right? Because once these symptoms start, it might be too late to have that insight, depending on the level of psychosis or the diagnosis for individuals. But I would love to see more people be able to start catching these signs early on and trying to get people in for treatment or at least to be evaluated before we get to some of these more acute phases. So, getting out of that now, what is the third and final phase, Kit?
So the final phase is the residual phase, which is the natural conclusion to the psychotic episode. Hallucinations and delusions might still be there, but they'll be less intense. And they've run their course, and it's becoming a more chill environment, if you could really be saying that. And maybe that doesn't quite make sense, but it's things stabilize is what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say. I'm trying to say things stabilize. And so for me, a lot of people hit the residual phase with the help of medication and treatment. That's where a lot of people end up in it. But in my case, I kind of hit one naturally. And it was actually when I got to that point where things calmed down. The quote unquote God that I was worshiping and interacting with wasn't as scary. He was not as upset with me. And I started thinking to myself that maybe maybe none of it was real and that maybe everything I'd gone through was all in my head. And so in my residual phase, I thought to myself that if everything was real, I was screwed. And if it wasn't real, I was screwed. And so I went with the not real option, got help, and now I am where I am today. But I still remember hitting that residual phase naturally without the help of medication. And it was because of that that I was able to get insight into my condition and get help for myself, even though I'd already had the prodromal phase and the acute phase that had absolutely destroyed me and my life. But it was the residual phase that got me the help I needed because I was able to get insight from it. So that's my residual phase story. I'm sure it was different for you. So what did your phase look like?
Yeah. So when I talk about the residual phase, I do mention for me it didn't come naturally. Who knows how long it would have taken? And we also should mention here this isn't a set timeline for
Yes,
anyone
yes.
or any like this can be different for every single person. My mom went 10 years undiagnosed and she also didn't really hit a residual phase until she was medicated. So it can be very different person to person. Who knows how long I would have went in this really acute phase, especially because I was using, which only amplified my symptoms, made it worse, and likely would have, lengthened this phase for me. So for me, I didn't really get to experience the residual phase until I was on medication and I was going to treatment and I was finally seeing success in some of these things. And this is what I love about having Kit on here. I think we get to show people very different sides of this disorder or both of our disorders, and we get to really see like the journey isn't the same for everyone. And what I love about, had our first guests on here. We had Steven on here, who also had a very different experience having, childhood schizophrenia. We have plenty of guests lined up who will also have very unique experiences with not only the phases they go through, but with how they get treatment and recovery. So I just want to mention that because I think it is important for us to acknowledge that someone might hear this and be like, oh, well, Kit a few years in started experiencing a residual phase, so my loved one might also be coming up,
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and we can't really trust on that. We do need to still try to seek intervention and try to help people before they get to these phases. But it is important to recognize that there is a subset of people who might hit this residual phase earlier and be able to have a little more insight and seek out treatment. I know one of our other guests that I'm mutual friends with as a schizophrenia advocate kind of got to experience that themselves. But I do know a lot of the people we're going to talk to in the schizophrenia space also didn't get to experience the residual phase until after medication and treatment. So we get to kind of show both sides of that and what that looks like and how that's different for us. Do you have any like final things people should think about when we're talking about early signs of schizophrenia, specifically if someone who's out there who is a loved one of someone who either has schizophrenia or might be worried their loved one has schizophrenia?
The biggest thing is that if you see your loved one acting a little bit differently and you don't really know why, look into it, talk to them, see if they'll speak to you about it, and maybe you can figure it out before it gets bad. There's actually treatments out there for people who were in the prodromal phase, and if you can catch a essentially schizophrenic episode in the prodromal phase, you could actually keep them from going on to develop more severe symptoms. So if you see something's a little bit off with your loved one, they're pulling away, they're talking to themselves a little bit more, look into it and maybe have them go see a professional, because if you catch it early, you're doing them a whole lot of good. I wish someone had caught mine when it was happening, but I just hid it so well and ended up being my downfall in some ways. But that's the best advice I can give to anybody listening.
And I would echo that and add to it. I think when you see warning signs of someone withdrawing or not taking care of themselves, struggling with personal hygiene, we're not even saying that is schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, but those are
Mhm.
reasons for concern. Uh, One of the difficult things with early signs of schizophrenia, if you look up early signs of any other mental illness, there is overlap. So
Mhm.
if you see some of these early signs that we mentioned today, we're not trying to tell you, once again, we're not doctors. Please don't sue
Yeah,
us.
please
Uh,
do not. Please do not sue us. Please do not sue us.
we are not experts. We just know that these symptoms appear in more than just one illness. So it is always a good idea if you are experiencing these symptoms and you recognize it, or if a loved one is experiencing it and you see it, uh, try to acknowledge it. Try to see if you can get them care before they get into a point where it might be really hard for them to accept care. Because, like me and Kid have mentioned, there are periods where someone might not recognize that what they're experiencing is bad. They might not be able to acknowledge or even comprehend the severity of their symptoms. So this episode is a reminder that we need to fight for earlier intervention. That is the best way to help people living with this illness in the future.
Well said. Well said. I think all of that is really important, and it's easy to listen to two people talk about it in hindsight, but when you're in the moment experiencing it or someone you know is experiencing it, it's really scary. It can be quite terrifying. But if you've got an inkling, you got an inkling that there's something up, do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. And once again, we appreciate all your support. Check out the cosplaying as a neurotypical person shirt, now available on my website. Also, mine and Kit's link trees as well. Thank you guys for listening, for watching, however you're consuming this. Kit, any final words for the people?
Yeah, guys, if you have any guest ideas or topic suggestions, reach out to us on social media. We are Skits and Giggles on Instagram and TikTok. That is skits like schizophrenia and all spelled out, and giggles like, well, giggles. And if you don't want to do that, you can also reach us directly at skitsandgiggles@gmail.com. And while you're here, make sure you like the show or rate the show if you haven't already. It's a free way to help us out. And we absolutely love that you guys have been giving us such good ratings so far.
Awesome. And as always, Kit,
Guys, remember the brain is a minefield and we brought flip flops.